have Kevin. Oh, thank you. Today we have Kevin Mack joining us, and I will hand it over to Brenda to do a quick introduction of Kevin. Brenda, you're on mute still.
Oops, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our meeting today. This should be an excellent presentation. Our guest speaker today will present the indirect cost negotiation process. In the past, Paula Milano was the lead for this work up until her retirement. So Kevin Mack is our presenter today. He is the divisional finance leader and training and engagement manager in the financial planning and analysis office in the finance division. So anyway, enjoy the meeting. Go ahead, Kevin, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Hannah and Brenda, for the introduction and partnering with me and the invitation. Most importantly, I'm so excited to be here today. This is an amazing opportunity, as you know, Brenda just mentioned, with Paula Milano's retirement. It's a little bit of a change in the guard for our F&A rate and ICR, which is today's discussion. So I'm still moving into this space, learning it. Please keep that in mind as we move throughout today, but very excited to be here. So, you know, my quick introduction too on, you know, how my background, how I got here. So I joined Berkeley back in 2014 as career staff. Before then, I was a consultant for Huron's higher education practice, where I actually spent 3 years before 2011 to 2014, helping with the Cal planning implementation and the contracts and grants suite implementation. So I spent time consulting in both the budget office and in the controller's office. Well, my higher ed background really began as a graduate assistant at DePaul University while I was studying for my MBA. It was really then that I knew I wanted to find a way to stay in academia and in the university setting, but try to find a way to use my financial background as well. So that's really where that, you know, took me into Huron after completing my MBA. But really why I find it so fascinating too is because for F&A in particular, it's an opportunity for me as a finance person, finance background in the budget office, to engage with the research side of the house and the academic side of the house of a university setting. And today is just an absolute wonderful example of that. And so I'm also really grateful, not just on the research side in general, but today, this group of folks, the research administrators, you are on the front lines. I mean, you are working with faculty, you know, directly with them. You're posting transactions. You are ensuring that the costing is correct. You might be engaging sponsors. You are doing the work that is critical in order for us to even build an F&A rate. We'll talk about what all that means. But I just really want to say that today, this community of people, you know, on the front lines doing your work, your day-to-day work is absolutely important. F&A is just a look back at what has already happened. And so the work that you're doing today and really next year, and I'll get into that in particular, it's going to be super important to building our F&A rate and the ICR process and negotiation. So with that said, and my background, moving into the agenda for today, what I'm hoping to cover, and this is my first opportunity with this group, so I'm really looking for feedback at the end, and you can send that to Brenda too or Hannah, so we can tweak this and make it better for any time, you know, in the future I might be coming back to speak here. But I'll give a little overview to F&A. We'll move into the federal rules and regulations. We'll cover that, might move that through that a little quicker than some of the other pieces, but it's important to know that this is, you know, there are federal guidelines around costing that we must adhere to. I'll move into how do we calculate the rate, and then we'll kind of dive in and do a little bit about Berkeley in particular. What is F&A at Berkeley? What are the numbers? You know, how do we define it? And then we'll kind of wrap up with some group discussion. So I'm hoping if you could please save your questions, if any come up throughout the presentation, save them to the end. It might get answered, you know, with a few slides down the road. And also I'm hoping to save time for a group discussion. So I also want to hear from you and from everybody on the call today. It looks great. We almost got 60 people. Really excited to hear, you know, what kind of questions you have and kind of try to have a little group discussion at the end. So what is the overview, right? So facilities and administrative F&A, right? Their costs, they are things that can't be easily identified to a project, right? Such as facilities and administrative infrastructure. So when we talk about indirect costs, facilities and administrative costs, F&A, overhead, these are used interchangeably. They all mean the same thing, right? The actual collection or reimbursement of those costs, of those overhead costs, that is what we know as indirect cost recovery. So there really are two fundamentally different things: F&A costing rates and the ICR or the reimbursement to cover the costs. So when we think about F&A, it's usually expressed as a rate and as a percentage of direct costs. I'll get into that in more detail, but that's important to know up front. Now, our rate, Berkeley's F&A rate, and we'll move into what this rate really means, right? But just so you know up front, right, it's 60.5% this year. It was finalized in 2019 based upon 2015 costs. Yes, that's correct. It took about 4 years between 2015 and 2019 to finalize our rates. There is a lot of time that we must build in when we work with the federal government when it comes to that negotiation process. That's the last step in the F&A rate calculation. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it can take some time. They are understaffed really in this office, and so we know that we need to build in time when it comes to actually working with them. But when we think about the rate, and as I mentioned, it's expressed as a percentage of direct costs. We can also think about total costs, right? So total costs are going to be both the direct side, that's the stuff that you are mostly working with, right? Directly charging the sponsor for costs. And then there's the indirect costs. And both together, those are total costs. Right, so if we at Berkeley were to charge a sponsor $1.61 to conduct $1 worth of direct research, right? So the 61 cents, which is right that 60.5 or 61%, that's where we're getting that 61 cents. It's equated that 61% of our rate. That 61 cents for F&A is approximately 1/3 of the total, right? 61 cents out of that $1.61. So it's also important. I know we're getting into math early on, but it's important to understand if we're talking about as a percentage of direct costs, looking at total costs, we're going to talk about the effective F&A rate. There's different, we've kind of got to ground ourselves into understanding what percent is this saying and what is it, what does it really mean? So why is it important? Well, why is it important? This is really critical, right? The F&A rate is negotiated with the federal government. It is a requirement to negotiate with them. If we don't, we have to use the de facto 10% on F&A, the F&A rate on federal awards. We do not want to do that. If we use 10% as opposed to the 60.5 that I mentioned in the last slide, we would severely under recover for our research costs. So we definitely we are basically required to negotiate with them. That makes the F&A extremely important. The reimbursement is unrestricted funding. It's green dollars. We'll get into more what we can do with it, but it's unrestricted. The recovery of these costs is critical to the institution's ability to continue to engage in high quality research. The indirect cost recovery, though, it's not revenue. It's not revenue. It's a partial reimbursement of expenses in support of research. We'll unpack this a little more. But so the funds are associated with the F&A rate. They're in addition to the grant award amount for the direct costs, right? We talk about total costs, right? Direct and indirect, right? So they are in addition to what you would receive for the grant from the sponsor. So the rate agreements, we talk about the federal agencies, moving into a little bit about the federal rules and costing. There's really two: O&R, the Office of Naval Research; DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. That's who we work with at Berkeley. We work with DHHS. You may also hear CAS as another acronym, the Cost Allocation Services branch within DHHS. There are 4 CAS offices. We obviously work with the San Francisco office, who I mentioned is a little understaffed. There's some turnover happening there. But that is the office within DHHS that we would negotiate our F&A rate with. So federal regulations, you may be probably familiar with the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200, right? There's a lot to this, but really the point being A21, the colleges and universities, that's what the Uniform Guidance replaced. There's other OMB circulars. We are following, though, the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200. That's our gold standard. That's what we must reference when we're looking at building F&A rates. But why do we do that, right? Educational institutions, we must follow a special set of federally defined cost principles. So the OMB uniform guidance, right, it determines the costing policy. So we always are going back to that for reference. It would provide standards, methods of cost determination, what's allowable, what's not allowable, right? What's allocable and what's not allocable. We'll talk about that too. Those are two different things, allocable and allowable. It also provides alternative to indirect cost allocation methods. There's a short form and a long form. We don't need to worry about that for today. You know, we are the long form method when it comes to calculating our F&A rate, because we are a large, very high research intensive university. So we do the long form. I mentioned a little bit about the negotiation process. As we know, that's step 6, right? There's 5 steps forward. We're just talking about in aggregate. What is the, how do we think about developing the F&A rate? So all expenditures and agreed upon base year must be included in the rate calculation. Very important little tip here. Berkeley's base year is next year, FY 2023. Super important. So next year's expenses are what we're going to build the F&A rate upon. That's why I go back to the opening slide. It's so important. I'm so happy to be here today because your work, particularly in that next year from July 1 to June 30, is going to be what we then have to recalculate the F&A rate upon. So the first thing we do though is accumulation of expenditures, right? So that'll be next year's base year. Well, all current expenditures plus building and equipment depreciation, interest, all these things. The proposal must tie to our UC financial schedule. So that's kind of step 1 is getting the F&A rate to tie to what our published UC financial schedules are. Then we'll start to exclude things. Once we kind of gather it all together, we start taking things out, right? We might take out unallowable costs, things like fundraising. We're going to do MTDC, modified total direct cost based adjustments. I'll talk about MTDC, so don't worry about that. We'll get into that a little more. But like things like financial aid, equipment, we have to exclude certain things. Then we got to start to classify everything. Are they direct costs or indirect costs? After that, then we start to allocate out those pools. We'll start to allocate out the indirect costs based on certain drivers. We'll calculate the rates. There's actually multiple rates. The one we care about is the OR, organized research F&A rate, but there are actually other rates that can be calculated from this whole process. And then we go into negotiation with the federal government, which can take time, years. Typically though, the rate negotiation process, it includes a formal proposal to the federal government. They will likely come back to us with a set of questions. Some are the standard questions. Some might be based on specific to Berkeley and what they're seeing. We typically will respond to those questions. They can be very detailed and in the weeds. And then they also typically come on campus. So the federal government, they will come on, they might review some of the spaces, walk the campus, confirm our space study that we do as part of the proposal. So there can be, COVID has complicated things, but a presence on campus, a back and forth Q&A on questions, and then obviously time just negotiating what the rate is. And we'll get into why things change in that negotiation process. But that's kind of the high level of how we go about it. Overall, it's going to be about 1.5 to 2 year long process, right? From when you really kick it off to then submission and negotiation, it's at least 1.5 years, could go longer just because the federal government may take more time to actually get back with us. So that the end can be the longest part, depending on how quickly they can circle back and get with us and negotiate. So the F&A rate, so the simple definition, right? So now we get rid of the calculation a little bit. We've covered kind of the federal piece and why it's important, the requirements from the federal side. How do we actually calculate this? So it's just a big division problem, right? On the numerator, we have the F&A indirect costs. These are costs that cannot be identified to a specific project, program, or activity of an institution, like the lights, right? The lights are on in the building. They're kind of for everybody. It's not benefiting any one particular project. That's an indirect cost. Direct costs, right? Because we said F&A is just expressed as a percentage of direct. Well, that's the denominator, direct costs. Those are costs that can be identified to a specific project or program. So what does the federal government say? It's a little bit of federal jargon, but I do want to make this point for two reasons. One, that we always need to go back to reference, right? Costing policy or the uniform guidance, but it also impacts us a little bit more, right? They are these F&A costs, they're costs that are incurred for a common, right, or joint purpose. I'm kind of bolding out of the federal jargon here, but we really need to think about how to think about this. They're not readily assignable, right? It may be necessary, though, to establish a number of pools of indirect costs. And we'll talk about those different pools, but it could be many pools, not one, even though all these pools are essentially not readily assignable and for a common or joint purpose. Direct costs, the converse, right? So direct costs, we're looking at costs that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective, directly assigned to such activities relatively easily and with a high degree of accuracy. That last point's critical. The high degree of accuracy, particularly when we're getting into the negotiation, we need to be able to back up our numbers. We need to be able to say, hey, this is the crosswalk to tie into our financial schedules. And then we must be able to back up any rate calculating that we do, right? We kind of have the general ledger, all of the costs that are going to be that we pull from, and then we calculate the rate on top of that. We have to be able to back all that up with a high degree of accuracy. So these things are really critical as far as directs and indirects and what you want to really pick from and think about when you're looking at these two different buckets. So the rate calculation, it's essentially an equation, like I said. It has F&A on the top, direct expenditures on the bottom of sponsored research grants during the fiscal year, right? That's the denominator. So the numerator, right, is you can break that down now, right? We can break that down. There's actually facilities costs, and this is particularly for OR now. We're talking about the F&A rate for organized research, that you would add the administrative overhead associated with OR, organized research activities, add those two together as indirect buckets, divided by the direct cost of OR, that's your F&A rate. So let's keep going down. We're going to keep going down, right? So the numerator, when we think about facilities costs as part of the numerator, what is great about this? As we see in the parentheses, it's uncapped. So that means that the federal government is going to allow us to put as much cost as we can with a high degree of accuracy, right? That we can put in for facilities related costs. It's uncapped. So we can put in as much as possible. What goes in here? Building depreciation, equipment depreciation, interest that's related, and I'll explain how this all can relate to organized research, but interest on capital expenditures if we were to take out a loan to build the building, O&M, operation and maintenance of plant, right? That can include things like from EH&S, police, physical planning, utilities. O&M is the biggest bucket for Berkeley, for most institutions in the F&A world. O&M has the largest bucket of costs where we can really think, and we have a little bit of a sandbox to play in to try to get as much cost associated with facilities and O&M into there. And the library is also part of this. It's usually a smaller component, but important when it comes to indirect costs in the facilities bucket. Now, we kind of go back, right? Also the numerator, there's two buckets, facilities and administration. Administration is the other piece to this. This one is capped. So this is already getting into why we don't fully recover. It's a partial cost recovery, partial reimbursement, because of one issue right here. We're capped at 26%. That is the most we can add as far as administrative overhead related to research. And what goes into this? General administration, right? Campus administrative units, maybe HR, accounting, department administration, the deans of department offices. There is a small allowance that we can add for faculty effort related to administration. Sponsored projects, right? Administration, contracting, grant accounting, SPO, right? Those are probably most familiar for this group here, right? We know SPO and CGA, they can't be attributed to any one particular award. They're helping out all the awards. They're part of overhead. They're part of the indirect cost bucket. And there's might be a small percentage for student services administration, but it's usually negligible within this bucket. But ultimately, we're capped. Most universities are over the cap. So I would say we're probably maybe 30 to 32%. Don't hold me to that because our last proposal from 2015 but that we are over it. So we are automatically kind of capped at what we can recover. Those are the numerator, right? So what's the denominator, right? So the denominator are the direct costs, right? Indirect divided by direct. So we look at the direct cost basis. What's in there? What's the denominator? Well, this is where I mean that there's actually multiple rates that we can calculate when we go through the F&A process. Think about each of these buckets as its own denominator, right? So when we think about organized research, sort of the second bucket, that's the one we focus on. When we think about direct costs of OR, that's what creates our F&A rate. However, we can have direct costs associated with instruction, right? Of course, instruction, sponsored instruction, like training grants, department research that might be funded by the department, faculty activity that is not separately budgeted or accounting for, that's all going to be in IDR. OR is the converse, right? Research activity that is separately budgeted and accounted for, grants and contracts. We also have OSA, OIA, other sponsored activities, other institutional activities, right? The public service projects, sponsored costs that are not instruction or research. OIA is also kind of a large bucket of just where we park things that are never going to really impact our F&A rate, things around auxiliaries, athletics, service enterprises, unallowable activities, right? I mentioned step 2 in the rate process is exclusions, taking things out. So we might take that out and just put it into OIA. So these are the 4 sort of direct buckets that we see. And again, OR is the one that when we think about our F&A rate, that's really the bucket that we're focusing on for the direct side. So kind of putting this all together, right? So when we think about the cost rate calculation, this is what the cost pools, we're just really kind of putting it out, putting it back into that large just division problem, right? So we look at facilities costs that are indirect costs and uncapped. Think about all those pieces that go into it. The administrative costs, all those that go into it, you add those things up, that's the total F&A pool. And then we have it divided by our direct cost basis. And those are the 4 there that we have. All right, so that kind of puts it back all together in a much more, complex form when we think about how this rate is calculated. So important things to know. Allocable costs, right? So a cost is considered allocable, to a cost pool, whether direct or indirect, if it can be assigned based on a relationship of cause and effect, benefit derived, logic and reason, right? They can be a little squishy terms, but the fact is it has to be allocable to be part, right, and into this F&A rate, readily assigned, right, with a high degree of accuracy. We have to be able to back it up. It has to be reasonable. Sometimes, that's all it really is, reasonableness. These, these basic soft concepts of how we think about what is an allocable cost. And we'll get into how we allocate too with some of the drivers. Allowable costs, a cost might be allocable. We can find a driver to actually allocate this cost out to organized research or to instruction or to other institutional activities and such, but it might not be allowable, right, for purposes of developing the F&A cost rate. So it's kind of dependent. We got to have both together in order to, obviously put that in to our larger rate calculation. So one of the bigger concepts too, I mentioned early on that I promised I'd unpack a little bit is modified total direct costs. This is an important concept as well when it comes to F&A rate negotiation process. The denominator, so FTDC, it's used to compute the F&A rate as well as the base to which the F&A rate is applied. So when we think about this, what it typically means is salaries, wages, benefits, right? Those might be the things you're working with on a day-to-day basis or billing the sponsor for, materials, supplies, services, travel, subcontract expenditures up to $25,000. Those types of things are what MTDC is. What it is not is things like equipment, right? We have to exclude equipment from the MTDC. Now, if you're, kind of catching on to what I was saying a few minutes earlier, we exclude equipment, but we capture it. We do capture it for the F&A rate, but what do? We capture the equipment depreciation as overhead as part of the indirect cost. So in some cases here, what we're seeing is, well, we exclude it here, but what we're doing is capturing it somewhere else, right? So capital expenditures for building and improvements are excluded, patient care charges, we don't have a medical center, but tuition remission, if I mentioned financial aid, subcontract expenditures in excess of 25,000. These kinds of things are going to be excluded from the NTDC base when it comes to developing the rate. And I'll reference MTDC to kind of help, now that you understand hopefully what it is and what it is not, right? How that then plays into the rate calculation process moving forward here. Next few slides. So when we mention the allocable and allowable, these costs that when we allocate out, but how do we do it, right? How do we think about this? Well, the allocation, it refers to the common measurable base used to allocate an F&A cost pool to either write a basic or indirect F&A cost pool. Now, how do we do it? There's some drivers. Net assignable square footage. What we think about this is why our space study is so important. If for those of you that have been through an F&A rate proposal before, you might be aware that we conduct a space survey with the proposal. We want to know how much of a building, take one building, for example, do a space survey. We want to understand how much that building is dedicated to organized research versus instruction versus other sponsored activities or other institutional activities, right? We need that breakdown. That's important because if we have, so for example, we use net assignable square footage, we use that to allocate depreciation, O&M, interest cost pools. So if we have, let's say $1 million in building depreciation that we can use to allocate, well, for a building, right? We bought this building, it's being depreciated, we have $1 million of depreciation we can allocate. We do a space survey and we say, oh, okay, this building is 50% research, 25% instruction, 25% other activities. Okay, 50% research, we have $1 million in depreciation, we can allocate 500,000 to the F&A rate indirect, the numerator of the F&A rate calculation. So the space survey becomes critical. For anything where we're using assigned square footage to allocate out a cost, we really want to know with a high degree of accuracy how much in particular is for organized research, right? That's where our focus really is. And so that space survey is really important. We will be likely, the plan is to kick that off in about a year, a little less than a year from now. So there'll be more training, communications, things about that coming, but just know that it's an extremely important part of the F&A process. We can also use FTE to allocate, right? How much FTE is dedicated to organized research. We can use these things to allocate out libraries and certain components of other cost pools. We could also use MTC, modified total cost, or MTDC, modified total direct cost, and I mentioned kind of what that's about. We can actually use that number to also allocate out costs. So here's kind of a visual for that. I can be a visual learner. So I'll hopefully kind of try to bring in some visuals here a little bit. As you can see, we take is depending on the indirect cost, which is kind of the left-hand side column there, building depreciation, interest, right? Those, as we know, are sort of the indirect costs that we've been introduced to already. Different drivers to allocate those costs might be square footage. Kind of gave that example a minute ago. Maybe we're using FTE. Sometimes we use salaries and wages. How much salaries are being paid on organized research versus not? That's a way to get at roughly how much to dedicate to OR. We use different drivers and we allocate out those pools to those 4 buckets, right? There's kind of 4 denominators. The one we care about, again, is organized research. That's the one that we build our F&A rate upon, but we need to allocate it out across, right? So every dollar is accounted for. It is going somewhere, right? We have to make sure that it is going somewhere with, again, a high degree of accuracy that we can readily and reasonably back up and support, assuming that the federal government may come knocking with questions. So this kind of hopefully gives a little visual of how the pools and the drivers, the allocation makes its way across the various direct cost pools. So what I want to do is kind of take a little a couple minutes over mid, just to give a little video here and kind of take a break for those that are saying, Kevin, can you please stop talking? Well, happy to do so for a minute and just show a little video. And so what I want to tee this video up, it is UCSF. So hey, we're all UC, right? Sister campuses. We got love for everybody. The UCSF has done a little video. And so I don't want you to focus on the numbers, just the concepts of what this video is all about. And we can have a little group discussion after if there's any thoughts to it. But let me share the video here. Just 1 second, please. Should have it up. And it's just going to be about a minute or two. So very small clip, but it kind of drives home, hopefully, the concepts that I have introduced everybody to already. So hopefully, Hannah, do you see the video? Let me know too if there's any audio issues. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, I see the video.
Great, here we go.
Conduct their work, which is where the second type of funding comes in. The federal government also reimburses academic research institutions for the facilities and administrative costs associated with their research. These funds are sometimes called F&A or indirects. This funding helps pay for costs of buildings, both new and old, especially designed for research, maintenance and security for all of our research spaces, benches, desks, and computers, electricity, water, air conditioning, and heating for research spaces, IT to support and meet computing needs, and staff to ensure compliance with the government's environmental health and safety regulations that protect our researchers, staff, students, and patients. These F&A costs are an essential part of the price of doing research and totaled $253 million in 2016 for UCSF. But the federal government covers all these costs, right? Wrong. In 2016, the government reimbursed UCSF just $160 million, or 63% of total F&A costs associated with federal research. UCSF made up the difference, paying $93 million to cover the remaining costs. This means that for every $1,000 in federal research funding that went to UCSF researchers in 2016, the university had to raise another $183 to keep the lights on and maintain all the infrastructure essential to our research. Why? Unlike other federal contractors, universities are limited from claiming the full cost of overhead expenses necessary to their research. This is due in part to an exacting negotiation process with the government that requires research institutions to identify and defend costs associated with federally sponsored research eligible for reimbursement. Existing government-imposed reimbursement caps on certain types of research grants and on administrative costs further erode universities' reimbursement rates. And although the F&A cost reimbursement process isn't perfect, the decades-long partnership between research universities and the federal government is key to our country's success in advancing biomedical research, leading to life-saving treatments and improved health outcomes for patients.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there since we're not in the pursuit of biomedical, well, maybe we are in the pursuit of biomedical research out there. I'd love to hear if we are, but I did want to kind of just create the clip with UCSF in mind, but for Berkeley, it's the same concepts that apply, right? So we must find a way to negotiate with the federal government, and we are capped and hindered. It's true for all universities, not just Berkeley. It's true everywhere that there is a shortfall, but all of the ICR that we do collect is critical to then supporting the university at large and the research mission, of course. So I just want to give a little, hopefully that video is just a real reinforcement and a little change of pace. I'll move back here to the presentation. We're going to move into actually a little bit about Berkeley in particular. Slideshow presentation, right? Should be this one. All right, hopefully we have a great, thanks, Hannah. All right, so we're back to the presentation. So I wanted to move into, so we've covered, all right, obviously the federal piece, we've gotten, into the math with the rate calculation. Hopefully, that was, we weren't really in the weeds, but I wanted to give a little more than a very high level. So hopefully it was a little informative to just the fact of the complexity that goes really into the rate calculation, and again, just how critical this group is to ensuring that we get it right when it comes to next year, the base year for our FNA rate. So for Berkeley, total expenditures, current expenditures, we're over 2.5 billion in FY21. Our sponsored research direct costs were over 400 million. Now this is, you're going to say, well, Kevin, so what I'm doing here is I'm looking at contracting grant funds on program code 44. We know that to be our organization or organized research. There's different ways we can look at what are the direct costs. We're not talking about awards though, right? Awards, they could include both direct and indirect costs. They might be over multiple years, right? Depending on how the award goes. So we're not talking about awards or, pledges or things like that. Looking in the past at FY21 closed book, what are those costs in that July 1 to June 30 period say in that particular contract and grant fund organized research program code. We can also gather that last year we recovered about 130 million in indirect cost recovery. So that was what was returned to us, right? The FNA rate is what helps us calculate the cost, for federal awards. We do collect back 130 million last year. 130, right, as a percentage of direct costs, right? This gets to the point of FNA is really expressed as a percentage of direct. That takes us back to slide 1. It's really an indirect rate of about 30%, okay? Or we can look at it in the way of total costs. 130 million of ICR is about 25% of 530 million of total costs, right? Direct plus direct for sponsored research. So there's different ways we can look at it, but in reality, our rate is going to end up our effective rate is lower than 60.5%. And we'll move, I'll have a slide here in a minute that really kind of explains that. So with our FNA rate though, you might be curious what goes into Berkeley's rate in particular, right? That 60.5%. So it's going to be made up of different buckets, right? It gets kind of this point. Here's thinking about the numerator, right? We have an administrative bucket, a facilities bucket. So calculated versus final approved, it's different. And I'll explain why it's actually much lower, right? We calculated closer to 80%. Well, Paul and Milano calculated closer to 80%. We got 60.5, so it's lower. We're already under recovering our total research costs because of this. You can see that O&M is the biggest bucket as far as like the percentages goes. I mentioned that already. Building depreciation is the third largest, but it might be concerning because we can only take building depreciation and interest particularly if we have new research buildings coming online, which we at this point in time, I'd say we don't have a lot, and we won't have many research buildings coming online as we did in 2015. So this is an area of a little bit of concern because it is such a big bucket, and we don't have a bunch of buildings coming online in the future that I'm aware of. Anyway, library is small. If you take a look at that component, 2.9% calculated, 2.5 final approved. Small, but just for Berkeley, it's actually relatively high. Most universities are around 1 to 1.5%. We actually have a larger percent. We have a lot of library costs, and we tend to get help on doing deep dives. We have in the past anyway, of helping to figure out our library rate. So ICR is not revenue, right? We mentioned that. It's a partial reimbursement of expenses in support of research. So this is kind of a little waterfall. It really kind of puts it all together. Hopefully this concept we've talked about today. So we look at all costs, right? This is based on 2015, okay? The proposal from 2015, all in around 200 million in indirect overhead costs in support of research, right? That was the calculated ICR rate based on actual campus expenditures, close to 200 million. Now we're already down to 87% or 175 million because of those caps I mentioned. The federal government restricts us at 26% total for our administration cap. So we already under collect just because of the federal government rules and regulations. Then we actually might move into negotiations with the federal government. They might have their own thoughts in mind. They absolutely do not want us over recovering. During the negotiation process, we'll see further evaporation of the rate because they don't want to see large jumps, right? They don't want to see us to go from 60% to 70%. They want a smooth, right, increase in our rate. They don't want us to over collect. The negotiation process tends to lower it further. And then the final waterfall there, the 59% of actual costs, we collect less than the full ICR rate because we can't do the full rate on state awards from foundations, state agencies, other entities. It's only the federal government can we actually do the 60.5. Plus, we also waive our FNA rate on some awards. So when we do those waivers, and then obviously we're not only working with the federal government, we will not apply the full weight to our awards. So that's really why that 4-step process brings us down to having a gap. For UCSF, it was 93 million. For Berkeley in 2015, it was an $80 million shortfall. So how does our rate stack up, right? To some of our peers, some of our other UCs, our current rate of FNA rate on campus is 60.5. You can see that it's actually relatively high compared to some of our peers. UCLA has traditionally been lower. It's really interesting. Michigan's, MIT's, I had to triple check those. It's really fascinating where we are. Now the 60.5%, I will say, only went into effect recently. The government tends to have us do a step up. So when we think about the step up here, this kind of gives the historical FNA rates at Berkeley, right? So back in 2002, we were about 50%. So it's risen over the last 2 decades to 60%, right? The federal government wants to see a smooth, not big jumps. And so that's kind of the historical rate too. What I want to say here is we did request an extension. We would have actually gone in with our proposal for FY21, but because of COVID and the pandemic, being unable to really conduct a space survey, we requested to the federal government a 2-year extension, which is why our base year is actually FY23. So if some of you on here that have been around since the 2015 proposal, like, isn't it about time for one? Yes, it should have been, but again, we requested that 2-year extension. We can request up to 4 years. We requested a 2-year extension to kind of hopefully get us through COVID, which seems to be what has been true, and into a year that's more reflective of our costs, right? So hopefully that's going to prove to be helpful by doing that extension into FY23. So we also should make just one little point here on the Space Sciences Lab. SSL has a special rate, FNA rate, dating back to when NASA was funding SSL's building and equipment in the 60s. We've tried to ask them to just collapse the Space Sciences Lab into Berkeley's rate so we can have one rate, but they have denied that request. So SSL FNA rate is 34% compared to our 60.5 on campus for Berkeley, and they have an off-campus rate of 24%. So it's just important to know if you work for the lab that they do have their own rate, their own proposal that is going to be collapsed in part of the larger Berkeley proposal that we'll be, again, engaging with next year and getting going on next year. So we can optimize the rate. There's different ways to optimize it. I'm going to kind of speed through this because we've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to try to save some time for group discussion questions. And many of these, frankly, are just out of our individual control, right? We need collective leadership to also find FNA important and part of our strategy. And if we do, then we can, do various things. Try not to go over the cap, right? Invest in research facilities. Right. Also, in many of these bullets are about investing into space, making sure our space is for faculty and for research, put them in the higher costing spaces, put administration in the lower costing spaces, right? That's kind of how in general we want things to do. There's many ways you can think about, optimizing it. But again, they in many cases you need campus leadership and larger strategic decisions made in order for those things to happen. You want to direct charge where we can, where it's allowable for those here today, right? If you are directly charging as much as you can, but obviously that it's allowable. We want to try to reduce our subsidies, right? Reduce waivers. Cost sharing hurts the FNA rate calculation. It makes the denominator bigger, right? Anytime you have a bigger denominator, you have a lower percentage or a lower rate. So cost sharing, you want to try to limit those things. The one I highlighted in yellow, though, particularly for those for research administrators that are really doing the work orders, working again with faculty, working with SPO, CGA, building budgets, buying equipment. Again, that kind of work is super critical. And if the more we can improve the quality of that, creating less errors, making it timely, the better our rate calculation can be, because it all starts with that kind of transactional ledger activity. and then building our rate on top of it. So I feel like that's one lever for me, for all of us, that we can actually have some control over. I just want to end with a few myths that hopefully might be tools for you when you go back out there to the front lines. When you think about overhead recovery funds must be used for the purposes for which they were originally justified. That's a myth. We can spend overhead reimbursement any way we want. It's green, unrestricted funds. They're not federal funds, right? So we don't have to spend them back into federal awards. They can be used for any institutional purpose, including costs that might not be allowable using federal funds. So we might have to exclude costs up front, unallowable, but the ICR that we recover is really green money. The overhead rate's based on audited institutional direct and indirect costs and the calculated base year. Okay, so the overhead recovery is reimbursed to the institution for costs that have already incurred, right? It's reimbursement for costs in the past, right? So for using travel as an example, if the expenses claimed must be justified, they might be audited, but the amount reimbursed for travel belongs to the traveler. Similar, the overhead costs paid to the campus are reimbursed to the campus. Another myth, the overhead from research generates net revenue to campus. I think we know this one, right? Research generates costs, right? As well as overhead return, which partially recovers, offsets those costs. Now we can think about certainly contract and grant revenue. Don't get me wrong, right? We need contract and grant revenue. Research is critical. When we think about overhead, right? From just the F&A perspective, right? So when we think about Berkeley's 2015 calculated real overhead rate, it was higher than 60.5. We saw that, right? The calculated rate was higher than 60.5%. We're not fully recovered for various reasons that we've already gone over. So I'll go ahead and skip that piece. But we know hopefully why that it might not be a full recovery. If we reduce support to service levels to PIs, we will violate our overhead contract with the federal government. That's a myth, right? The university's rate agreement with the government is about costs, not services, okay? So the rate, whatever those costs are in that year, that is what we are using to develop the rate, right? So our rates are a snapshot of costs in that year. We negotiate rates that apply for a predetermined length of time. The rates don't change, even if the service levels change. Okay, so if building maintenance or like a janitorial service, if in a research area decreases or maybe it ends, it's not an indirect cost issue. It doesn't violate our rate agreement, right? But we might not be able to pass along those costs to the sponsor, so we might lose out. But it has nothing to do with the services. When we think about our F&A rate, it is based on costs in the past that have been incurred. I'll just say lastly, looking ahead, there's other opportunities that we can do in our F&A rate, with our financial strategy going forward. We might want to consider these, right? If we have limited debt capacity, that could impact our F&A rate in a negative direction. As I mentioned, if we're not putting on new buildings or using debt to finance those buildings, it's going to potentially impact our F&A rate. Is higher necessarily better when it comes to the F&A rate? No, right? It's not, right? For instance, the higher F&A rate lead to a higher number of waivers, right? If that's the case, then it's not good, right? The rate should really just be reflective of the cost. If our costs were 50% and our rate is 50, then that's great. We just want to align it, right? We want to align the rate with actual costs, whatever that number is. It could be 40, 50, 60. It doesn't matter. So a higher is not necessarily better. We could obviously implement space strategies. I kind of mentioned those on how you want to focus on faculty and research in our highest, most expensive spaces. And I would also note that Berkeley's financial sustainability initiative, we are scoping that, and ICR might be a topic, right? How we actually allocate ICR to campus, how we collect it. It is potentially part of the financial sustainability initiative. However, they're still writing the scope for that. And so I checked in last week. It's still not final. We're not sure, but it was on the list of, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 other topics, although I don't think campus leaders intend to cover all of them. So we'll see, but don't be surprised. I would also say, if that becomes part of the review, to say, how is ICR? Let's dive into it. Let's really think about it. And is there ways that we can make it better, for campus? So just to wrap up, we're going into a proposal year, right? I mentioned that next year. So it's important to get it right. That's again why I'm so excited to be here. And hopefully this has been an informative presentation for everybody about F&A, what goes into it, the process, how it goes here at Berkeley. So I would really be curious. I know we only have a few minutes, but if there are any burning questions, I can do my best to answer them and or get back to you if I don't know the answer. And I would also, if there aren't many questions, I'd be surprised, but if there aren't, I would love to hear, what questions are you getting as research administrators from faculty and from PI and faculty folks? What kinds of challenges do you have around FNA? This is going to help me with my job. And so I would really love to open this up, for the last few minutes, or maybe, Hannah, we could have if there's some facilitation needed, feel free to, if you could help me out with that, that would be great. But I would love to hear, just open it up for these last few minutes. And I can stay, for a few minutes after 1:30, but I do need to kind of do a hard stop maybe by 1:40. But I would love to hear from folks if you have the time and you have anything.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Kevin. And I'm going to go ahead and put the link to our survey in chat right now. It will be emailed out later for those of you who cannot stay. And I wanted to remind everyone that the recording of this presentation, as well as Kevin's slides, will be made available at a later date. And so, yeah, feel free to unmute yourselves or use your virtual Zoom hand to raise your hand and ask a question.
So I just wanted to say there are a couple of questions that came anonymously in the chat, but I also see that Katie Hudson has her hand up. So
Yes.
I'm sure she
as does Pam.
Okay, should I go?
Go for
it, Katie.
Okay, I just had a question out of that. You were mentioning, Kevin, about more expensive buildings, there being incentive to house research there. I'm kind of thinking that older, potentially less desirable buildings might be our most expensive buildings to maintain and operate. In which I'm just wondering, is there like some, campus difficulties around space allocation where, sometimes the heavy researchers have the most say and want the fanciest, newest buildings that might actually be cheaper to run, or I don't know if there's anything about that.
I glean, that's a really interesting point about the older buildings might be the more expensive buildings. Not having done the space survey yet myself, I can't speak to any particular building. What is our most expensive one? I'm certainly looking forward to getting to those answers. But you're talking about space management too, right? Which is certainly more James Ford and the academic planning team and space management team, which is separately, that separate process, which I wouldn't want to probably have any understanding of, because that must be a complicated process of space management and how faculty feel and who gets the newest space. I'm looking forward to partnering more with the space team to understand that. And when we go through the space survey, I think they're as eager as we are to do it. But I don't, that would definitely be probably a political hot potato of how do we think about who should get what spaces, the newer spaces versus the older spaces. But your point on the older buildings being more expensive, I'm going to take that, because that's an interesting thing to think about. And if that really is true, that could change the way we do think about the strategy, right? Because ultimately, and that's why I was setting this up about, we need strong campus leadership to help with these kinds of hot topics, because that is really what it's going to take to kind of, do some of those things you were mentioning, at least around space management, I would imagine. And so we would really need, leadership to come in and say, FNA is important. These things are important, and this is our new strategy. And I know we're going through too, I guess I would also say the future of work initiative with the future of work group. And so I do know we are thinking about space and, who should be in those spaces, how should we think about space? So there's also that, and maybe there are things that come of that. I'm not on that work group, but that hopefully they are trying to prioritize faculty research and just the academic side of the house when it comes to thinking about it, going forward in this new world where many of us are teleworking now, such as myself, and has opened up space for others on campus.
So Pam, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. I just wanted to thank you for such a great presentation. It was really very thorough and complete. I do have a question for you, and this is the kind of question that, everybody wrestles with, which is, how do you convince faculty that F&A is something that is beneficial and they should be keeping on their projects instead of trying to eliminate it as much as possible. I just wondered if you might have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Pam, for the feedback on the presentation in general. It means a lot. For my early on of doing this, I feel like this is a question that I really want to, strive to try to make better. I think there's a couple things. And this is early on in my career with this F&A work, but certainly a portion of this is to understand that ICR does find its way back to supporting the research mission. So the more that we can get back with it. Now they're going to say, well, I'm not seeing it, right? Because Berkeley's allocation model of ICR, right, is to bring it back to the central campus where obviously we then allocate it out for, again, all of those overhead recoveries. So I think part of it is difficult, is always going to be difficult unless the faculty or PI see some of it returned to the dean or to the department. What I've noticed is in universities where that happens to some degree, it's never to some degree, you can see more buy-in from faculty, right? I even had one story from I think it was UCSF, where the space survey went out and the dean was like waving the thing in the area. We need to fill this out, right? Because if the more space that we can do and allocate back to OR, right, the higher the indirect cost recovery and the higher our return, our portion, our piece percentage is. And so when they see it, I feel like there's actually more buy-in. They're leaning into the whole process, and that's just tremendous. So I think part of it is going to be a little bit of a struggle without them really seeing it. Right? We have our BEAR grants, which kind of is a return to ICR, but it's not a direct link back, and that's going to be a challenge for Berkeley until we decide to change that model, which again might happen if it's baked into the financial sustainability initiative. So there's a little bit of a challenge that we might have depending on how it gets back out. There's a little bit of, again, it is though, no matter what, in support of research. And so if we want to continue to make it a mission critical core piece to Berkeley, we want ICR return. The third piece I think is just the education of it. What I would love to see is, kind of what UCSF has, that video or something that hopefully when they understand more what it's about, I also wonder if there's just an education gap and really what it means and understands. And that's where I was excited to get with this group today, since you are on the front lines. But the way that the story is written too, and how they educate themselves with it, and maybe there's things I can do to make that better, right? To educate faculty and PI, but maybe there's a gap there. So those are my early thoughts, better education, how are we allocating it out? And, but then also standing on that fundamental fact that it does get returned in some way, shape or form to supporting the research mission. Those would be my early things, but Pam, as we move along, I'd be curious to, if there's other things we should think about or do to try to build that story, because I totally get that it's a challenge with faculty and PI to really build up the importance of this and not put it aside or feel like they're losing out, or they're, competition, with awards and things like that. And that's the other piece too, the competitive piece. I mean, all universities have an F&A rate, right? So they all are putting them into the budget. And you think about this, right? Let's think about this for a second. We negotiate our rate with the federal government, right? That is the same. There's the same entities that faculty are putting their budgets to, right? I'm talking like the NIH, for example, right? So we put the budget in and we apply to the NIH. We're essentially putting into the budget indirect costs that we've negotiated with the government. So I find it hard to think that the government would make that a negative or something that, would give us less chance to receive an award because of our ICR rate, again, the rate that we've already negotiated with those same federal government entities. And so, you think about it in that space too. I just wonder, I have not heard of a federal agency that takes ICR as a, a point to the competition, but maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I would love to hear again other thoughts, but yeah, I think that's kind of one thing. Do I have anything off there, or things that we should try to focus on more deeply, just based on?
I think all of your suggestions are really good. And I think the federal government doesn't usually balk at indirect costs. I think our private foundations are a little less supportive of it, because I think a lot of this is due to not understanding what it is and what it's for. So the presentations like this are helpful.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to say that there is a knowledge gap with the faculty on what F&A and indirect costs are. Going to your group discussion questions here, like I've had faculty go on a rant about UC Berkeley taxing their grant and taking over 50%. And that's really the way that some faculty view indirect costs. I've had faculty like ask me, like, what is this? Like, what goes into it? And I explain the whole F&A and facilities and administration and, keeping the lights on and all that kind of stuff. And once you explain it, they understand it better. But I think that they do, like, they still view it as the university taking a cut of their money.
So I have wanted to get to the two anonymous questions. After one of them was answered. So another question was, what are the main sources that cover the cost of business that the F&A rate does not cover, and like tuition? And then the other question was, how does the F&A get directed back to the departments? And I think you kind of said it's not.
Right, there is no direct line. We collect ICR centrally into the central budget office. And then obviously the central budget office allocates out the perm budget, the general allocation. And so that is it, but there is no direct line of ICR back to a dean or department or faculty PI member. The only thing that's a direct line is our bear grants, which I think are maybe total campus total. I'm not sure. I don't know. Actually, I shouldn't. So, but I'd say is the bear grants, they're small. It's smaller dollars, but those do go, my understanding, I don't facilitate the program, but those go back directly to a PI or faculty member. And when it was formed, the bear grant, at the time, it was just like a 3-year pilot, but it was, in its fundamental sense, meant to try to return ICR back to faculty or PI. Now that was quite a few years ago at this point, even past the pilot program time. I think we still do the bear grant program, but that would be the only way that it's really returned. Other than that, it's in the central ledger and it gets returned just as part of the general allocation, which obviously we're sending out to everybody, right, on campus, from academic units to overhead administrative units and the like.
And then the main sources for making up the difference, and I'm guessing that's the California state budget that makes up the difference mostly, right?
Yeah, I mean, making up the difference is going to be all ways, shapes, and sizes. I mean, it's luckily where we're seeing some good news, I would say recently, right, with the state government, the state budget, cohort tuition and things. And so, but I wouldn't say that we make up the gap in research by, state support. Really, our state support is to fund faculty's salaries and benefits. That's kind of the direct line there. The 19900 funds that we see, the state support is roughly equivalent to what our faculty costs. And so that is it's not a policy or set line, but that is just in general what we see. So it's not coming from the state support. There is no line that says, oh, your gap is 80 million, we're going to give you 80 million. We have to find a way to make up that gap with just other revenue, other central resources, or other department resources as well. There is no direct, solution that we have every year. It's not part of, the broader central budget discussion to say, okay, here's the gap. How do we find it? It really just, we get the 130, we see, and we aggregate all of the cost, expenses and revenues for campus, right? When we send things up to the chancellor, we're looking at things campus wide and in total. And those gaps, along with any other gap, is just going to be part of the bottom line to the budget that we have to address. And that's going to happen from shifts and trade-offs, and any other ways that we address it are going to be, other ways around than things specific to F&A. What I hope is that we can try to move in a direction where kind of those slides are on opportunities. If we can try to implement opportunities or ways to better collect, we can find ways to shorten the gap, right? And that we can do that sort of indirectly by thinking about how we'd allocate space and those types of things. But there isn't really a direct solution that we think about year to year when it comes to that under recovery of the research costs. So
Thank you. Anyone else have questions before we go?
I see no hands raised.
I see no hands raised either.
And feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share what kind of questions your PIs ask about indirect and F&A.
Yes, I mean, I would still love to hear, from anybody on the challenges,
Yeah.
what they get, questions, particularly if something wasn't covered, but it's burning for you to understand. So I can, try to unpack that, in another presentation down the road.
Yeah, and if you don't feel comfortable unmuting and speaking to the group, that's perfectly fine. And you're more than welcome to email myself or Kevin Mack, and I'll relay the message to Kevin.
Yeah.
But yeah, his email's up there. And again, just to remind everyone, the recording and the slides will be made available. I'm not 100% sure when, but shortly after the meeting. Kevin, could you email me your slides?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you again, Kevin. This has been a great presentation. I hope your office is working on a cool, fun little video like UCSF. That would be great.
I mean, as I said, one of my hats is the campus training and engagement manager. So I do have a little bit of ability to create videos. So
Awesome.
we will see, where we go with it. But yes, thank you again for the invitation. Can't wait to be back. The questions you have are great. It totally helps me with the insight. And I hope to see this group again. And thank you.
Yes, thank you for presenting to us. This has been fantastic. And thank you everyone for joining us. Bragg is taking the summer off, so the steering committee is getting together in August to start planning our presentation. So please keep an eye out for updates via email on any upcoming meetings. And again, after this meeting, we will send a thank you email with the survey link and hopefully a link to the slides and the recording if that is available.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.